Hello there, this is Anna from Start Abroad. I'm here today to talk to you about the most popular neighborhoods in Lisbon and Porto for expats. There's only so much I can get into in this video, so if you're interested in getting a more full write-up of these neighborhoods, why we like them, why you might not like them, if you want access to all of that, please go ahead and download our Portugal Neighborhoods for Expats guide. I'm going to include a link to that in the description below. It's free, and hopefully that can be helpful to you as you're trying to decide where makes sense to live for you in Portugal. Without any further ado, let's look at these neighborhoods. Okay, neighborhood number one, which I would say is actually probably the most popular in Lisbon, is Estrela. So Estrela is especially known for lots of green spaces. It's very family friendly. There are quite a few good schools here. It is quite hilly, something to be aware of if you're a little bit nervous about walking around Lisbon. Estrela is definitely one of those hilly neighborhoods. I would say there are a couple of sub-neighborhoods that are a part of Estrela. Lapa is often thought of as kind of the more upscale part of Estrela. There are lots of embassies here, a lot of beautiful older buildings that have been renovated. As you go closer down to the water, there are a couple of other neighborhoods that kind of come in and overlap. You have Santos, which has a little bit more nightlife. It's a little bit of a younger vibe. The other downside of Estrela is that the connection to transportation in the city isn't as good just because there's not a metro station here. They say that there's one planned, so we'll see when that might come about. Next up is Alcanta. This neighborhood, I've got a lot of clients recently that have been very interested, in particular in Alcanta. The most important hub location to be aware of in Alcanta is LX Factory. It is a really growing, trendy place for all kinds of shops. They have a farmer's market on the weekends, sometimes a flea market. There are lots of restaurants here, lots of activity and bustle. It's really like a reclaimed part of the city. It's quite creative feeling because it has a little bit of a hipster vibe. Now, that's not to say that that is the entire neighborhood, but certainly if you want to live close to LX Factory, it's a popular area, growing in popularity, and it's a little bit more expensive, but very cool, very trendy. There are some good parks in this area as well, especially if you're going to live a little bit closer to the Estrela side. And this neighborhood provides also a really nice sense of diversity, definitely between locals and expats of people from all over the world. The iconic view of Alcanta is the 25th of April Bridge, which goes right over the neighborhood and across the river. Next up, in terms of popular neighborhoods, I would say Ktoq. This is a favorite of a lot of people who want a neighborhood feeling, better walkability, a little bit flatter in this neighborhood, access to one of the best markets in the city, also very family friendly, a great neighborhood if you have kids, also access to good schools. It is bordering Estrela to the north, so there is some overlap here as well in terms of, I'd say, the vibe of this neighborhood. The probably biggest downside to Ktoq is the noise from planes flying overhead. So if that's really going to bother you, you might want to look elsewhere. Next up, Aveiros Novas. This area is also, I would say, increasing popularity for our clients. We really like it, especially because there seems to be just more availability of nice, high quality redone apartments. The other thing that really characterizes this neighborhood is the mix of commercial and residential. So there is a lot of business being done in this area. Certainly that means it's a great place for things like co-working spaces, but it also means that it can feel a little bit quiet on the weekends and then busier during the week with people going to work. And this is the shopping district. So if you want to go to any of the larger department stores, to the malls, things like this, you're going to be spoiled for choice in Aveiros Novas. The other thing that's really wonderful in terms of the feel of this part of the city, it is the area of Lisbon that has these wide tree-lined avenues. A lot of people compare the feel to being in Paris. So if that's the feeling that you're interested in, definitely check out Aveiros Novas. I will say it is one of the more expensive neighborhoods, even amongst the ones that we're talking about today. Next up, Santo Antonio, just to the south of Aveiros Novas. Santo Antonio also borders the center of Lisbon. If you want to be further away from tourism, further away from, some of the hustle and bustle of the center of the city, Santo Antonio might not be for you. However, if you want to be in a place that feels like you're in Lisbon, in the heart of the action, centrally located, really well connected to everywhere in the city, lots going on, lots of bars, restaurants, nightlife, cafes, all kinds of shops, Santo Antonio could be a great fit for you. There are also a lot of great apartments in this area. This neighborhood is also one of the most popular, I would say, with expats. So if you're looking for a place that's a little bit more of a soft landing, where it's easy for you to make friends amongst other expats as well as locals, it could be a great fit. And the last thing I'd say about Santo Antonio is that it does feel a little bit more luxury, a little bit more upscale as well. So if that's a feeling that you're excited about, check it out. Okay, next up on our list. This neighborhood is a favorite, I would say, particularly amongst people who are maybe a little bit younger, digital nomads, and that is Grassa. It is very centrally located. It's actually just above Alfama, which I would say is the most picturesque, popular neighborhood for tourism in Lisbon. Grassa is really nice because you get that same feeling, the same historic cobblestone streets, the same spectacular viewpoints over the city, but with a little bit less of the busyness and the tourism that you'd find in Alfama. There are a lot of steep hills, again, here, and as I mentioned, narrow cobblestone streets. So if you're going to be driving a car, if you're going to have any challenges with walking, this might not be the best neighborhood for you, but there is so much charm here if you are excited about that. The other nice thing about Grassa, I'd say, is there's more of like a village-like feel, and it's the type of place where you can stumble across a square with people drinking wine during happy hour after work with live music very easily. It's characteristic of the neighborhood. Next up, and I always have a hard time pronouncing this neighborhood name, so forgive me, but Aveiros. So this is a neighborhood that I'd say has recently gained a lot of popularity amongst our expat clients. It is also a pretty mixed neighborhood in terms of it's a really large geographic area as far as neighborhoods go in Lisbon. And I would say that the southern part versus the northern part have slightly different feels or characteristics to them. Aveiros was actually recently called by Time Out magazine one of the coolest neighborhoods in the world. So, this has really pushed it ahead in terms of popularity. It's definitely a really cool mix of cultures, diverse, a younger feel in terms of the energy. There's a really great international food scene here in particular. It's also very well connected. So if you need to take the metro, there are several metro stops within this neighborhood alone. Now the downsides are that it can be a little bit noisy, especially if you live on one of the main thoroughfares in this neighborhood. And there is a variety of building conditions. This is one of the neighborhoods where I'd say you might see some more rundown buildings, some more graffiti. Now that's not to say that it's not necessarily safe in that area, but aesthetically, it's going to look a little bit different than, your Avenidas Novas. Next up, Belem. Belem is definitely known amongst visitors to Lisbon for having some of the most iconic sites of the city, but it's also a very peaceful and tranquil residential area once you get away from the waterfront. One of the top benefits of Belem is that it's beautiful. There's plenty of green space, lots of historic sites as well in Belem, beautiful buildings, a nice, calm neighborhood feeling. Certainly not as much nightlife or excitement, maybe, if that's what you're after. But if you want a more tranquil neighborhood feeling, you don't mind being a little bit further from the center of town, Belem might be for you. Belem is located to the far west of Lisbon proper, and it's not as well connected to the center of the city. So the real downside of living in this neighborhood is that it is harder to get into the center of town than most of the other neighborhoods we've been discussing. It's also a little bit more expensive. So with this beautiful green spaces and the charm of Belem come higher housing prices. All right, so that was a whole lot about Lisbon. Let's talk a little bit about popular neighborhoods in Porto. So first in our Porto neighborhoods is Santo Antonio. Maybe my favorite neighborhood in Porto, actually. Santo Antonio is quite central. It's just north of the central part of Porto, and it's very well connected. It is centered around this pedestrian walking street, Rua de Santo Antonio. It also is known for its art. It has a street actually dedicated to art studios and concept stores, which is quite cool. It has this reputation for drawing in creatives and art lovers. It also has a lot going on. So there are plenty of restaurants, places to go out, shops and stores, all kinds of things to do in this neighborhood. Now, the downsides, of course, are that given all of this centrality and popularity and creative energy, it is a little bit more expensive than Porto standards or averages. And the other downside is depending on where you live, especially if you live on one of the main thoroughfares, it can be kind of noisy. If you're used to living in a city, probably pretty standard, but if you're not, you might want to look elsewhere. Next up, Bonfim. I would say this is actually the neighborhood that I've seen the most interest in from our clients recently. And that is probably because Bonfim is a little bit better on the wallet than some of the other neighborhoods in the city. It is also changing pretty quickly though. So I don't expect those prices to last for forever. Bonfim feels a little bit hipster maybe, a little bit quirky. It has a lot of personality. It's known for its cafes, its vintage stores, street art. There are lots of craft breweries coming up here now for the first time. So if you're into all that kind of thing, it might be a great place to look. It's also, as I mentioned, a little bit cheaper, especially for rent, than some of the other neighborhoods in the city, although that is changing. Bonfim is also very well connected to the rest of Porto, so easy to get around. And then we think of Bonfim as being pretty family friendly as well. It is not as noisy of a neighborhood. Okay, next up, Boveja, and this, not too dissimilar from Aveiros that I was talking about before, is a blend of the residential and the business district. So you have here what I would describe as kind of a more sophisticated and upscale vibe in a lot of this neighborhood, and it can also be quite quiet, especially on the weekends when businesses are closed. There's a good amount of green space. The neighborhood is very well connected to the rest of the city. It's definitely not touristy at all, and I would say it's more popular amongst Portuguese than it is amongst expats at this point. Now, if you are looking for a neighborhood that gives you views of the ocean while being accessible to the center of a major Portuguese city on public transportation, walkable, fairly affordable, Matosinhos might be the place for you. I think if I was living in Porto, this would be where I looked first. So the great thing about Matosinhos is that it is located on the coast, but it is also connected by the metro to the center of Porto. Within about 20 minutes, you can be in the middle of the city. It also is quite walkable, it's family friendly, it's pretty quiet. It's really known for its promenade along the beach that actually goes, you can take that promenade all the way through Fase, which we'll talk about next, and into Porto proper. It is more affordable than other locations near Porto on the water, but I will say the prices have gone up quite a bit recently. There are great beaches and parks here. It's one of those places that I would recommend checking out if you would love to be near to the ocean, if you have pets, if you have kids, and you don't want to be in the center of Porto. Okay, next up, speaking of waterfront locations, Foz do Douro, also known as Foz, is our final Porto neighborhood that we're going to be talking about today. Foz is really known for being trendy, upscale, having beautiful waterfront dining, nice shopping areas. All of this is easily accessible in Foz. It's also quite walkable. It's well connected via tram and via bus. Foz, I'd say, is really popular amongst retirees and families in particular, largely because there's some good schools here. And also it's pretty quiet and tranquil, and as I mentioned, easy to walk. Now, all that said, that does come at a little bit of a higher price tag than the other neighborhoods that we've talked about so far. And another one of the downsides is that there is not metro access here, so if you want to be getting into Porto via public transport, it's gonna have to be the bus or the tram. Okay, let's just wrap up by talking about how to find the right neighborhood for you. Our number one piece of advice when you're looking for a place to live in Portugal or anywhere in any country that you're not familiar with is to visit. There's really no substitute for being in a place and experiencing it for yourself. Now that said, if visiting is not an option, and let's say that you want to move on the D7 visa, the digital nomad visa, what often makes sense is to get a place in a pretty well-connected area, pretty central location for the first year while you search for your long-term home. In that case, a place in Lisbon or a place in Porto can make a lot of sense, even if you think that in the long term, you're gonna end up in a smaller town or in a suburb. If you're trying to figure out where you want to live in Lisbon or Porto, and you've decided that you're ready to go ahead and get yourself a rental, get yourself a visa, Start Abroad is here to help. We specialize in assisting expats make the move, including figuring out where is the right place for them to live in either of these cities or across the country. I'm going to link to some of our most popular services below. If you have any other questions about where you should be looking to live in Portugal, sign up for a free 15-minute consultation on our website at startabroad.com.